Now that we can restart the game, let's get these stats working so they flow through and actually show on our stats box. The first step is I'll go to controller and I'll create a new bool, game completed, and set this to false. So this will check whether the game has been completed, irregardless of whether it's been won or lost. So these two scenarios, the game can be completed when the game is won. So here, guessed word equals correct word, game completed is true. The other scenario is the user has completed all 6 lines that we have in Wordle. So here I'll write if current row is equal to 6, at that point in time, game completed will be true. So now we know when the game has been completed. At that point in time, we want to calculate the stats. So if game completed is true, then let's call a method calculate stats. Now let's set that up. We'll put this in a new file. And I'll create a new method in this new file, calculate stats. And now we want to create a series of variables which will represent the key stats. So these will all be of type int. So the first one, games played, set that to 0. Games won, set that to 0. Win, percentage, current streak, max streak. Okay, so we have our key variables. Now let's update those variables. So when we call calculate stats, that is when the game has been completed. So games played should increment by 1. Likewise, if the game has been won, we should also increment games won. So we need to know when the game has been won. So let's create a parameter up here, game won, and our controller, which calls this, will have that information. So we can say if game won, then our games won tally will increase. And when our games won increases, so does the current streak. So I'll increase that by 1. Likewise, if we lose the game, our current streak gets broken and reset back to 0. Now let's check if the max streak has surpassed the current streak. So if current streak is greater than our max streak, then we have a new champion in town, and our max streak will be assigned the value of our current streak. And the last variable we need to work out is win percentage. So that'll be equal to games won divided by games played. Now we want to return this in a whole number. So to return this as an int, I'll wrap these in brackets and write toInt. And also we want to return this as a percentage. So I'll wrap these in another bracket. So after that's calculated, we'll times this by 100 to return that as a percentage. So we now have our key stats set up: games played, games won, win percentage, max streak, and current streak. Now we want this data to persist, so if the player closes the app and then reopens it, this data is not lost. So let's use SharedPreferences, which we've used earlier, to save the theme. So let's use that to save the stats for the game. So because we already have SharedPreferences set up into this project, we can just write SharedPreferences. And the first thing we need to do is get an instance. So we'll use the getInstance method, and let's return that in a variable, final prefs. And because this returns a future, we need to await that. So use the await keyword. And when we're dealing with a future, we should write a sync up here, just between the brackets. Okay, so now we have prefs. We have 5 different ways to save simple data. Last time we saved a bool. This time, however, we want to save a series of data. So let's use setStringList. And this has a key and a value. So let's make the key nice and easy. Stats. And now we need to save a list of string. So we don't have a list of int, hence we're just using a list of string. Now let's add these key values into our list. First one, games played. This is of type int, so we'll call toString to convert that. Games won, toString. Win percentage, current streak, and max streak. Okay, so we've now added 4 items to our list, and we'll save that to the device. Now before we update our values, we should also retrieve any existing values if they have been saved locally. So to do that, I'll create another method and I'll name this getStats, and we need to check if anything exists on the device first. So we'll use SharedPreferences, getInstance. So we first need to grab an instance of SharedPreferences, use the await keyword, and update the method so it's asynchronous. Now we'll use the getStringList method and pass in the key, which is stats. Then store this in a variable. I'll name this stats. First thing we should do is check if stats is not null, so something does exist. To recap, we're using SharedPreferences to check if any list exists with the key stats, and if we do have a list, we'll return that. Otherwise, let's return null. So let's return from this method a list of string. Now we have a red line, and that's because we need to wrap this in a future. So we need to return a future, and here we'll return our stats if we have them. Otherwise, let's return nothing. We'll return null. And if we want to return null, we need to make this list a nullable type, so I'll add a question mark here. Okay, so we have a future that returns a list of string. This list is a nullable type. If we have our stats already saved, then we'll return that. Otherwise, if this is the first time we've played the game on the app, then we'll return null. Okay, so we can now use this method up here. So before we update our variables, we'll call getStats, store our list in a variable, and we need to await that because we'll be receiving a future. Then we'll write if stats do not equal null. In that case, we want to update our variables with the values that we've saved. So games played will be equal to stats at the index of 0. So the order here is important. So the first item in our list is games played, then games won, win percentage, and so on. Now we need to return this as an int, but we saved it as a string. We can pass the string into a number by using int.pass. And because we converted that to a string, and now we're returning back an int, we should not have an error. Let's also do this with the other variables. So games 1 is the second item, so index 1. So let's recap. Firstly, we will try and get any stats that have been saved. If stats still exist, we'll assign our variables here with those values. We'll then update those values. And then down here, we'll use SharedPreferences again to set a new string list to resave the updated values. Okay, so now we need to call this method. I'll go to controller. In the controller, I'll uncomment calculate stats, import the library. Now we need to pass in game 1, and that is that variable up here, game 1. Okay, so we've now called this method to calculate stats every time the game is completed. Next up, as we'll have these main stats populate this chart by using a future builder.